DaVinci Resolve is packed to the brim with all sorts of different menus and checkboxes, and I know it can feel pretty overwhelming. In this video, I'm going to share everything that I know about two of the most confusing parts of the program, the preferences and the project settings. I'm going to explain what everything means and which parts actually matter. Now, this is going to be a real deep dive, so there's going to be a list of chapters in the description down below to help you find the parts that you need. And don't forget to save this to your bookmarks so you can refer back to it later. Now let's start with the Preferences menu. You open it up by hitting Command and comma on your keyboard, or Control and comma if you're on a PC. This menu is split into two parts, System and User. And in both cases, there are subsections that you'll see listed on the left. And we're going to work our way through the list. The system memory shows how much RAM you have on your machine. And underneath, you'll set how much of it is reserved for Resolve and Fusion. Now this is a power-hungry program, and it will use as much RAM as you can throw at it. So I usually just have it set to the maximum allowed for both of these. You can't assign the full amount because the rest of your machine needs some of it to function. Next, we have the GPU options, and you can probably set all of these to auto, especially if you're on a Mac. If you use Windows or Linux, you might need to pick between OpenCL or CUDA for the processing mode, depending on your setup. And if you've got multiple GPUs, you'll have some choices to make there. Next up, we have media storage locations. The first destination here is going to be what's called the scratch disk. That's basically the drive that Resolve uses as its workspace. You see, while you edit, Resolve is going to make temporary files in the background and save them to your scratch disk to help things run a little bit smoother. Now, this thing gets hammered the whole time you're working, so you're going to want to assign the first location to a really fast drive. It's also going to show up on the media page as a location. If I add a second location, that'll get added to the end of the list. This next option is about where you'll save proxy files if you choose to create them. Now, I made a whole video about proxy files that I'll link to below. But one thing worth mentioning is that when you import footage into Resolve, if next to that footage on your hard drive, you have a folder called proxy with the proxy files inside, Resolve is going to automatically link them up without you having to do anything. So I would use that first option here. And if you end up importing that footage into another project, Resolve will check to see if that folder exists, and it will link everything up automatically. So it's going to save you headaches in the long run. Next, we'll look at the decode options. For the first one, Blackmagic Raw decodes faster using your GPU, so leave it checked. For the second one, if your computer has built-in hardware acceleration for these codecs, this will let you use it. Keep that on and let Resolve figure out if your machine has the tools available. DCP stands for Digital Cinema Package, and it's the file that cinemas actually use to show films. Now, Resolve already has its own DCP encoder and decoder baked in, so it can create and read these packages right out of the box. This checkbox just lets you switch the decoding side over to Easy DCP instead, which is a well-known third-party tool for the job. You'd only tick it if you've actually bought and installed an Easy DCP license on your machine, and you specifically prefer using it over Resolve's built-in option. Automatically refresh growing files in the media pool is something you use in live workflows. If you've got another program recording video live to a file, so the file is sort of growing in real time as the recording continues, this will let you start editing that file before the recording is even finished. You import the still growing file into your media pool, and with this ticked, Resolve keeps checking it for changes and quietly updates its details as more footage gets added. Then we've got stream files during download from Blackmagic Cloud. So tick this, and you can start using a clip while it's still downloading from Blackmagic Cloud by streaming it rather than waiting. So instead of twiddling your thumbs waiting until the download's finished, you can just get on with your work straight away. Now for this next option about debayering files, your choice here kind of depends on your system. R3D files come off of RED cameras, and they arrive squeezed down to save space. Now, two things have to happen before you ever see a picture. First, the file gets unzipped. That's the decompression part. And then second, that raw sensor data gets turned into a proper color image. That's the debayer part. And it's the harder part where lots of maths involved. This setting is just deciding who does that work. Your CPU is the general all-rounder, and your GPU is the graphics chip that happens to be brilliant at the exact kind of maths that debayering needs. So the three options you have are none, the CPU does both jobs on its own, debayer, the GPU takes over the heavy debayer maths and the CPU handles the unzipping, or decompression and debayer, the GPU does the lot. For most computers, debayer is the safe bet. If you've got a strong graphics card and it isn't already busy, go for decompression and debayer and let it handle everything. But if your GPU is already working hard with something like noise reduction or a heavy fusion job, or it's just not particularly powerful, piling R3D decoding on top of that can actually slow you down. So the best advice I can give you is to test it yourself. Load up some R3D footage, hit play, and then watch for dropped frames. And then switch the setting and play it again. Now, whichever one runs smoothest on your machine is the right one for you. Now, there's no universal correct answer here, I'm afraid. It really does just depend on your setup. For the video and audio I/O section, what you see here is going to depend on what you've got plugged into your computer. Now, I can't remember the last time I had to capture material off of a tape deck. It's probably something like 15 years ago or so I leave that blank. I do have an Ultra Studio 4K Mini that's sending a feed to the big monitor above my desk, so I've got that selected there. I also select the option to release the video device when not in focus. That means if I'm working in Resolve and then I switch to another program, then the screen's going to go black. See, there's always potential for burn-in with OLED screens, and if I forget to shut down Resolve when I move on to something else, I really don't want it to be stuck on the same image for hours. I don't have any sound coming out of that monitor, so I ignore these last couple of options. For the audio I/O section, I have most things set to mirror the system settings of my machine. I've got a Scarlett 2i2 serving as both the input source for my microphone and the output for my speakers. I've left the 2 buffer size options to the default settings, and I haven't had any issues with those, but depending on your setup, you might need to tweak them if you're having playback issues. If you have multiple kinds of speaker setups, you can uncheck this section and set up custom outputs, and you can set up further combinations in the section below. Honestly, I cut everything in stereo, and anything that's super complicated we send out to a dedicated audio engineer, so I just don't touch this stuff. The same goes for this section on immersive audio. It's just not something I ever do, so I just don't touch it. Now, the next couple of parts are for dealing with plugins you've installed on your machine. This video one lets you turn individual OpenFX plugins on or off when Resolve starts up. Now, that's handy for 2 reasons. If you've got a ton of effects installed, you can trim the list that shows up in the effects panel down to just the plugins that you actually use. And if one plugin keeps causing crashes, you can switch it off to keep things stable. Resolve also checks how each plugin behaved last time. If one crashed or froze on the previous startup, it gets skipped automatically. To enable or disable a plugin yourself, just tick or untick its box in the list. The audio section has 3 parts. Up top is a list for the folders Resolve looks in to find your VST plugins. VSTs don't install to one standard spot on your machine, so if you install a new plugin and Resolve can't see it, you have to point to the right folder in here. Once your folders are added, the available plugins list shows every plugin inside them. Each one has a checkbox telling you if it's switched on. If a VST crashes Resolve while loading, it gets disabled automatically, so this list is also where you should go to troubleshoot. You can spot what's been blocked and switch it back on by reticking the box. There's also a category column. VST and audio unit plugins get sorted into groups in the Fairlight mixer, and you can move one to a different group by clicking its category name and picking a new one. This doesn't apply to the built-in Fairlight effects plugins, just VST and audio units. Sometimes you need to fix or shape a sounds that Fairlight just can't handle on its own. This set up external audio processors section lets you send that audio out to another program to do the job, like Isotope RX or Steinberg Wavelab. As the name suggests, this next one is for picking control panels that you want to connect to Resolve. Pick the one that's relevant for you and your panel, or ignore it if you don't have any. The head tracker section is for picking the head tracker profile you want to use for immersive audio. Now, I'm not going to lie, since I don't actually work with immersive audio, I've got no idea what to suggest for that one. Sorry. This last checkbox will enable or disable an icon in the bottom right corner of the UI. And if you click on it, you can see details about your panel. All right, the general section has a few things you need to be aware of. This first one only applies to the paid studio version of Resolve. Now, I'm not going to go in-depth into scripting in this video because that's a whole subject of its own. But if you have this set to none, then you can only run scripts in the console window, which you'll find under the workspace menu. Local and network is going to let you run scripts and applications that can control Resolve that live either locally on your machine or on a network. This next one is a Mac-only option as far as I know, and if you had the ability to display 10-bit images, I don't know why you wouldn't, so turn that on. Now these next couple work in tandem and they go some way to making sure that what you see within Resolve matches your exported file when you watch it in something like QuickTime or on a web browser. On macOS, ticking this tells all the Resolve viewers to use whatever display profile you've set in the Displays section of the Mac system settings. That means it'll be running Resolve's image through ColorSync, which is the same color system that the rest of your Mac already uses. ColorSync is the color manager built into macOS. Now, in very basic terms, no 2 screens are exactly alike. So your Mac keeps a little profile describing yours and then sort of nudges the image to suit it. Now, color managed apps like QuickTime use ColorSync when it plays a video, but by default, Resolve doesn't unless you tell it to. Now that is one of the big reasons why you get people complaining about something called a QuickTime gamma shift, where your grade looks one way inside of Resolve, but then you export it and then you open it in QuickTime and then the brightness or the contrast just doesn't match. Now, nothing is broken, it's just the 2 apps are displaying those colors differently. These 2 checkboxes help close that gap. They tell Resolve to handle color the same way QuickTime and macOS do. But with all that said, none of this really matters if your monitor itself is wrong. You see, straight out of the box, your screen might run too warm or cool or contrasty. So when you're trying to grade, you just end up compensating for those errors, and then the final image can end up looking really, really awful on a more accurate screen. So if you actually want to take this seriously, you'll want to regularly calibrate your monitor. You use a little device called a colorimeter, which sits on your screen and measures the colors it's actually putting out. Then it builds a corrected profile, so what you see is a way more accurate representation of your colors, not just your monitor's guess at it. I'll drop a link to the colorimeter I use in the description down below if you want to grab one. This next one is supposed to help if you're having issues connecting to Blackmagic Cloud projects because your company's got a firewall that's blocking it. I've never run into that issue, so if ticking that doesn't fix it, I'm afraid that's a conversation that you're going to need to have with Blackmagic and an IT professional. I would ignore this next one. Rec 709A was a fix that Resolve used to get around the fact that Apple devices tend to have a gamma more like 1.96 instead of a more standard 2.4 or 2.2. But they've changed the way the software works so that using Rec 709 Scene displays your image correctly. Now, again, all this color management stuff gets very long-winded, and I'm not going to get into it in this video. This next one is helpful if you work with other editors on a shared network. Basically, when you add something to your render queue, another machine that has access to that same project library on the same network can do the export for you. Or alternatively, you can run an export for someone else if you've got free time. These next three are pretty self-explanatory. This one caps your upload speed if you're sending a video to a Blackmagic Cloud presentation. If you don't have super fast internet, and if you're sharing it with others, you might want to turn that on so you don't completely saturate your upload bandwidth. These next couple are for using the remote monitoring features using your own networks and servers. Now, most of you will never have to worry about this, but if you're working for a company where security is a big issue, this is a section where you'll want to consult with Blackmagic and your IT department. This one will stop your machine from going to sleep if you're supposed to be downloading things from a Blackmagic Cloud project. This LUT section is for you to point to places on your machine where you have your own LUT saved outside of the default Resolve LUT folder, so they show up in the list of available LUTs. This background task section is new. If you've got a beefy machine, you can have certain tasks running in the background without tying up your machine, so you can keep editing. Now that said, it's really hard on your machine, and it requires a minimum of 32 gigs of RAM and 12 gigs of VRAM. Honestly, I leave this turned off and I just take the opportunity to get up from my desk for a few minutes. In the Internet Account section, you can log into the different services listed and upload videos to them directly from the Deliver page. As a general rule, I don't actually bother with that because I like to watch my exports before I upload them anywhere, just in case I've made a mistake. Then we have the Advanced section. Now, according to the user manual, this tab is used for special Resolve configurations and SAN parameters that are applicable to older file systems. I have never used this in my life, and I honestly doubt most of you ever will either, so we'll just move on. Now we're going to tackle the user settings. The language option lets you pick which language the interface displays. And I'm just realizing I have never changed this from auto, so I'm not sure how it knows to pick English. That might just be the default, I've got no idea. I never turn this option on because I always have several jobs on the go at once. But if you only work on one job at a time, I suppose this could save you a couple of clicks. If you have this next one turned on while you're working with a vertical timeline, you're going to get this little button that shows up in the UI. Click that and your timeline viewer will take up way more of the screen to make it easier to see what you're doing. This is available on the cut, edit, and color pages. Then we have show focus indicators in the user interface. This adds a thin red line at the top of the panel that's currently the focus of your program. It's really useful when you edit using keyboard shortcuts so you know which panel is active. So for instance, if you're marking an in and out point by pressing I and O, you can tell whether you're going to be adding them to the source viewer or the timeline. Show font previews will show you what the font looks like when you're going through the list. By default, DaVinci Resolve uses a blue-gray UI background, which supposedly is meant to provide what they call a more attractive experience for users. Turning this checkbox on switches DaVinci Resolve to a totally neutral, desaturated gray UI. The colors that your eyes see in the image are going to be affected by the colors that are surrounding it. So you're going to start compensating for it in the grade. See, that's why I've got gray walls in my edit suite. So just turn this on and never think about it again. Then we've got use gray backgrounds in the viewers. So when that's turned on, it sets the background of all the viewers to gray instead of the default nearly black, which makes it easier to see the edges of your image when you're making sizing adjustments. This next one is for working with old standard definition images that don't have a square pixel aspect ratio. Now, that's not very common these days, but just leave it on just in case. This next one is going to let you add a delay to the image that you see. If you're sending a feed out to an external monitor like a client screen, sometimes a delay ends up happening because it's traveling through all the other gear that you've got connected. So this can help them match up if it's causing you an issue. If you're dealing with interlaced footage, when you're parked on a frame, it bounces between the two fields that make up the image, and that can cause a really annoying flicker on your screen. This option is just going to show you one field. Oh, and if you've got no idea what fields or interlaced even means, I'm going to link to a video that I made all about frame rates that you should watch. Now, it's especially important if you're going to be working on stuff for TV. I usually leave this one turned off because if I've got a really heavy grade with like noise reduction applied to it, it likely won't play back in real time if I don't turn caching on, and I don't want to have the playback constantly stopping on me. I will have it stop a render if it runs into a problem, because I want to know about it. I don't want to get to the end of a render just to find out there was an issue in the middle of the file. The playhead shadow is something I've never had a use for. It adds an orange overlay around your playhead. And the weird part is you have to go to a separate part of the preferences to change how many frames before and after the playhead turn orange. I'll point that out when we get to it. 2D timeline scrolling is a personal preference. Checking this box will scroll the timeline vertically through all the video or audio tracks when you scroll the mouse wheel. Unchecking this box will scroll the entire timeline horizontally, so just use whichever feels more natural to you. The timeline sort order lets you set the default order that the timelines appear in within the viewer drop-down menus. That's another personal preference. They added a spell checker in version 21. You can select the language of your text here, or just leave it as auto. And this is where you can turn it on and off, but I honestly don't know why you turn it off. If there are words like names or acronyms that it constantly flags but you know are correct, you can add them to a list of words to ignore right here, along with a couple of other ignore options. In the project save and load section, keep load all timelines when opening projects turned off. Otherwise, it's just going to make your project open slower if you've got a ton of timelines in it. Under the save settings, turn them all on, set the numbers to your personal preference, and then just give yourself some peace of mind. I know Resolve is often seen as way more stable than something like Premiere Pro, but anyone who says it never crashes is lying, and there is no such thing as a 100% stable video editor. Cache management was introduced in version 20, I think. Check the box to automatically delete any cache files older than the number of days set in the field. Your hard drive will thank you. And don't worry, if you accidentally delete files for a project you weren't done with, Resolve will just automatically regenerate any files it's missing when you open it. There are a couple of other options under editing you might want to check. Start timecode is where you set the default starting timecode for every timeline you create. Files for broadcast will usually start at something like 01 or 10, so you can add things like slates or bars and tone at the beginning of the file. Now, since most of the work I do is for online platforms, I'm usually just starting it at 0, but it's good to note here. You can set the default tracks that show up when you create a new timeline. There's an automatic smart bin section, so if you use smart bins, you can turn on some automatic ones that will read the metadata you've got on your clips. And if you've got no idea what those are and you want me to make a video about them, let me know in the comments. Then we have a bunch of options for default durations of different tools and edits, including that orange playhead shadow thing we saw a little bit earlier. So set those to whatever makes sense for your workflow. If you find yourself consistently changing something like the length of a still when you add it to the timeline, just change it here and you'll save yourself a few clicks. The rest of this general settings section is fairly self-explanatory, and a lot of it's going to come down to personal preference for how you want certain tools to work. So I'm going to point out a few of the more common ones that you might want to change. If you turn on always highlight current clip in the media pool, whatever clip your playhead is parked over is going to be shown in the media pool. But if you've got lots of folders of footage, it's going to be constantly jumping around from clip to clip, and I find that really distracting, so I never use it. If you need to find a particular clip, just select it in the timeline and hit Option and F on the keyboard, and you'll be taken right to it. Normally, pasted clips appear at the playhead position in your timeline. If you check this box, they're going to be pasted according to the timeline in and out points instead. Now, I'm just used to the default behavior, but some people hate it, so pick whichever you want. If you've got a ton of fonts on your system, but you find yourself only using a few of them, you can make a list that just shows the ones you want instead of everything that's available. You'll need to set up a plain text file and list the fonts that you want, one per line. If you put an asterisk at the beginning and the end of a word, any font that's got that word somewhere in its name is going to show up. If you just put an asterisk at the end, any font with that word as the first word in its name is going to show up. Save that file on your computer somewhere, and then when you check the box, you just have to navigate to the file. Finally, for this section, you can set the default shape of the curve when you apply a fade or a crossfade. That's another personal preference. Now we're on to the color section. This first option is only for those of you using a physical Resolve color panel. It changes what the reset buttons do, specifically the trackball and the ring reset buttons of your primary color tweaks. If you turn it on, two things change. If you hit the all reset, instead of wiping everything back to neutral, it keeps your overall brightness where it is and only resets the balance between the red, green, and blue. So you don't lose the exposure you dialed in, you just even out the color. If you hit the RGB reset button, instead of resetting the 3 color channels, it sets all 3 to the average of whatever they were. So if one channel was pushed high and another pushed low, they meet in the middle instead of jumping back to nothing. Personally, I think reset should just mean reset, so I leave this off. This next one is another personal preference. If I grab a still on the color page and then load it into my viewer, the default behavior is when you're dragging the edge of the wipe with your mouse, it's going to circle around to the other side and continue that wipe over and over again. If you turn this off, once it reaches the edge, it will stay with the still full screen and you have to wipe backwards to make a split screen. Again, use whatever feels natural to you. I always turn this one on. If you add a window, it can be a bit hard to tell which part is the window and which part is the feathering or the softness. Turning this on makes them two different colors, so it's way easier to see. Now this one seems a bit unnecessary to me. When you've made a selection or added a window, if you hit Shift and H on the keyboard, you're going to get what they call highlight mode showing you your selection. Ticking this box shows you your matte in a high contrast black and white instead. Now let me turn that off again. If you press this button at the top of the viewer, you already have this black and white option, so you can switch between the two views. If you enable that option, you lose access to the grey option even if you hit the button. It just seems weird to me to take away an option, but pick whichever one you like, I suppose. Here's another one that comes down to personal preference. If you're grading a project with stacked tracks, this option is going to tweak how the next scene command behaves when you've got lots of clips stacked on top of each other. Next scene is how you jump from one clip to the next on the color page. You'll trigger it with the down arrow key or the dedicated button if you're using a panel. If you leave this switched off, that command walks through your clips one at a time in timeline order. It doesn't care how they're stacked. It's just going to land on the next clip, whether it's sitting on top or buried underneath another one. It just moves to whatever comes next. If you turn it on, it gets a bit choosier. When the next spot has several clips stacked on top of each other, the playhead's going to jump straight to the clip in the highest track. For this next one, if you're navigating between nodes using a keyboard shortcut or a panel, turning it on is going to skip over any mixer, splitter, or combiner nodes. This next one is going to decide how your nodes are numbered. With it off, if I add a few nodes and then add another one somewhere in the middle, the numbers on the node are going to change order to compensate for it. With that option checked, if I do the same thing again, it's going to keep the original order. Now, that's another decision that will depend on your workflow. Now, this is one I always turn on. With it on, if I copy a node on one shot, go to another shot, select a node, and paste it, it will do what you expect and copy that adjustment to the selected node. If I turn it on, even if I just select one node, when I try and paste it onto another shot, it pastes all of the nodes. I don't really know why you'd ever want to do that. If I wanted all the nodes, I would select them all. If you select these next two, you'll be using algorithms from before version 16 instead of the current ones to give you better results. If you are opening up a grade that was done in an older version of Resolve and you'd use those functions, I suppose you might want to turn it on so that the adjustments you made don't change. But other than that, just keep them off. This next one affects the histogram that you see in the curves panel. You can either turn it off, show the histogram of the shot before you make an adjustment, or show the result of the adjustment. Now, that's another personal preference. I'm usually looking at the main scopes on a second monitor rather than that histogram there, so I honestly don't pay too much attention to it. But I'm inclined to show the result so you get live feedback of your changes. Normally, when you jump between clips on the color page, it jumps to the first frame. With this option, you can set how many frames into the shot you start at. So if you'd rather jump a second or two into each shot, you can make that adjustment here. One filter you've got on the color page is a split screen to show the shots either side of the one you're working on simultaneously so you can compare them. This setting lets you choose how many shots show up on screen. This next option lets you decide what node is selected when you switch clips. You pick between the last adjusted node, the first node, the last node, and the same node. I've got this set to same node because usually I use a fixed node tree and I grade in passes. So by that I mean I might go through and just make exposure changes on all the shots. And then I go for a second pass for something like saturation or balance. Now, since I've got particular nodes that I use for each of those adjustments, it means when I switch shots, it's already going to have the right one selected. They've got two different types of color picker. DaVinci 2K is the old one, just pick whichever one you prefer. When you use ripple mode, you can make a change and then copy that change to a node on selected clips or all of your clips. Now, this setting is going to change how those adjustments are made. Ripple changes is another subject that really needs its own video. So if you use it, I'm going to put on screen what each one of these options do. So just pause the video and give it a read. Printer-light step calibration section is really for working with film and making sure that the film lab is matching your settings. So I'm going to skip that bit as well. All right, the Fairlight section is much shorter, so this shouldn't take too long. In this offset section, there's two settings that let you nudge your video playback up to 7 frames earlier than your audio to fix a sync problem. Now, this came up earlier, but sometimes the gear that your video passes through on the way to your screen can add a tiny delay. So the picture ends up lagging slightly behind the sound. Say your signal runs through a converter that adds 1 frame of delay, and then into a projector that adds another one. That's 2 frames of lag. So you'd set the offset to 2 frames to cancel it out, and then your sound and your picture will line back up. The drop down is where you pick the offset, anywhere from 0 to 7 frames. This tick box will make sure that the offset also kicks in when you're scrubbing back and forth with the jog and shuttle, not just through normal playback. In the general section, the first 2 settings here shape how the loop jog works, which is a Fairlight only feature. Loop jog plays a short snippet of the sound as you drag the playhead through the timeline. It makes it much easier to catch a specific line of dialogue or a music cue when you're scrubbing quickly. And if you stop and hold on a frame, that little snippet just loops over and over, so you can sit on a spot and keep hearing it. So you've got three choices for where that loop sits relative to the playhead. Just before it, pre, right around it, centered, or just after it, post. Loop jog width sets how much audio loops measured in milliseconds. Now how that translates to frames will depend on your frame rate. So at 25 frames a second, each frame is 1000 divided by 25, which gives you 40 milliseconds. The next three are separate general settings. Enable auto patching will send your first system audio input straight to whatever track is armed for recording. If you select mixer follows selected track, if you don't have all your tracks visible in the mixer, when you select one in the timeline, the mixer is going to jump to it so it's easy to find. Include mixer events in undo history lets you undo changes you make in the mixer, like a panning tweak or muting a track. Without it, those changes stick. These last two settings control automation, which is when the mixer remembers and plays back moves that you recorded, like a volume fade or a pan. Yet another thing I should probably make a video about at some point. Glide time is a value in milliseconds that sets how smoothly the automation eases from one point to the next. If you tick write on preset or clipboard paste, your automation moves get written onto the track when you load a track preset or copy and paste. One catch worth knowing. It still only writes what your master automation settings allow. So for instance, if you've got plugin automation switched off, none of that's going to be written even with this ticked. The playback settings help Resolve run more smoothly in real time. They mostly work by switching off or simplifying things that eat up processing power. You've got hide UI overlays. If you turn that on, Resolve will hide the on-screen clutter while it plays a clip, like the cursor, the power window, outlines, split screen views. The moment you pause, everything will come back. Minimize interface updates during playback is a similar idea, just a different target. You turn this on and Resolve will stop refreshing the interface so often during playback, putting that extra effort into keeping the picture running smoothly. Then we have use embedded thumbnail for stills. I'll be honest, there's no reference to this in the user manual anywhere, so I have absolutely no idea what it does. Performance mode is Resolve's way of quietly cutting corners to keep things fast, and these three buttons decide how much say you get in it. On automatic, which is the default, Resolve will make those calls for you. It balances speed against quality behind the scenes, keeping playback quick on screen while making sure your actual video output still renders at full quality. Now, for most people, this is the one to leave it on. On manual, you get to step in and switch off individual shortcuts. There are three you can disable. Optimize sizing changes how Resolve handles resizing the image. Optimize decode quality changes how it juggles a clip's own resolution against your timeline resolution. Optimized image processing changes how it handles the image processing work itself. And this last option, disable, just turns performance mode off completely. So Resolve stops taking any of these shortcuts at all. Honestly, I usually just leave it on automatic and let Resolve figure it out. The control panel section is where you can adjust the orientation and sensitivity of the trackballs and the knobs on your panel. Now, once again, these are all going to be personal preference choices. You can also adjust the brightness of the panel screens and the backlights down here at the bottom. And finally, we have the metadata section. If you use the metadata panel, you can use this to create custom presets of what bits of metadata you want to see. Now, there are a ton of different things you can turn on and off, so pick whatever makes sense for you and your workflow. All right, all of the settings we've looked at so far are going to affect every project that you work on. So now we're going to go through the settings that only affect the current project. You open them up by hitting Shift and 9 on your keyboard or hitting the little cog icon down here in the bottom corner. Just like the other preferences, they're split into categories down the left-hand side, and we're going to work our way through them one at a time. Under the master settings, we'll start off with the resolution of your timeline. I've got a bunch of presets, or you can type in a custom number if you're working on a project where the output is to a non-standard size. Resolve is resolution independent, so that means if you change the size, then any windows or keyframes or tracks that you've made should recalculate. So for instance, if you know you're going to be exporting a 4K video, you could edit a HD so it's a bit easier on your machine. And then before you export, you just change your timeline to 4K and everything should scale correctly. The use vertical resolution option is going to swap the height and the width. So if you're working on a 16:9 video and then you want to make a 9:16 version for social media, you can just check that box instead of typing out the numbers again. But remember, this setting affects every timeline in your project. If you want to change just one of them, right click on it, select Timeline, Timeline Settings, uncheck Use Project Settings, and make the changes there. Then we have Immersive Workflows. Choosing an option from this dropdown flips Resolve into a whole different project mode, where it changes a few different project level behaviors and reveals extra immersive controls. You have to switch the immersive workflow on before you import your immersive footage, not after, or things won't set up correctly. And in my case, since this is a demo project that already has a bunch of stuff in it, it's actually locked me out of selecting anything here. Normally, your choices are none for a normal non-immersive project like this one. Apple Immersive, which sets up the project for Apple's format aimed at the Vision Pro, and Standard Immersive, which is a more general option for formats like VR 180 and VR 360, including delivery to MetaQuest and YouTube VR. Now, immersive video is a giant topic all of its own, and it's something I really don't have that much experience with. So I'm going to move on to the other bits of this section. Pretty much everything comes in a square pixel aspect ratio these days, but if you happen to be working on something different, you can make that change here. The timeline frame rate is pretty self-explanatory. Right now it's grayed out because I've already got a timeline with footage on it. Once you start working, this number is locked, so make sure it's right from the start. When you make a new timeline, you can choose to not use the project settings and select a different one, but that can start to cause headaches down the road. So just try your best to get this right the first time. Now, these next few options only come into play if you're working on a project for broadcast. You'll need to look at your delivery specs to decide if you need to use drop frame or non-drop frame timecode. If you're new to this, enable interlaced processing will probably need a little bit of an explanation. You see, interlaced footage doesn't draw a full frame all at once. It splits each frame into two halves called fields, one holding the odd lines and one holding the even lines, and then paints them one after another. Now, I made a video all about frame rates that explains how it all works, and I'm going to link to that below. Anyway, tick this box, and you're telling Resolve to handle everything internally as those separate fields. So the two halves of each frame stay clean and don't bleed into each other. Now, there are a couple times you should definitely leave it off. Firstly, if your footage is progressive to begin with, don't bother. It gains you nothing and just pads out your render time. Second, if you've dropped interlaced clips into a progressive project and you plan to deinterlace them using the Enable Deinterlacing checkbox in the clip attributes, you can leave it off. If it's on, that deinterlacing checkbox goes grey on every clip and you won't be able to use it. If you're keeping your footage interlaced though, whether you need this comes down to what you're doing to the picture. If you're exporting out to an interlaced format and you're doing anything that shoves pixels around the frame, turn it on. Now that includes filtering like blur or sharpen, any open effects and any resizing or repositioning. All of those can smear one field's pixels onto the other, and field processing will keep that tidy. But if you're only touching color and contrast, so no blurring, no resizing, none of that, you can leave it off. That's the case whether you output it interlaced or progressive, and switching it off will actually shave a little bit off your render time. Then we have align clips to frame boundaries. With interlaced material, you get to decide whether your edits happen at the field level or the frame level. Tick this, and every edit plus every step of the playhead snaps to full frames. Leave it unticked, and both drop down to the finer field level instead. For playback frame rate, just set that to match your timeline. This next session is going to come into play if you're sending a feed to an external monitor through something like an Ultra Studio or a Deck Link, not if you're using the clean feed option under the workspace menu. If you are doing that, set the resolution and format to match your timeline settings. If you're connecting to the monitor using SDI cables, you've got a couple of options you might need to check. This one is for working in stereoscopic 3D, so you can send out both eyes separately at full resolution. The data levels only affect what you're sending out to your monitor, not the video you're exporting. You need to make sure it matches what the monitor is set to, or your image is going to look really weird. If you're using a broadcast monitor set to Rec 709, just set it to video. And then we have retained sub-black and super white data. You see, video has a hidden bit of headroom above pure white and below pure black, and footage sometimes carries details in there that will sit outside the normals or 1 to 100 range. Tick this box and Resolve will pass those out-of-bound values through to your output untouched. Leave it off and Resolve will clip them, so anything above white or below black gets chopped flat at the edges of the legal range. Video bit depth sets how many shades of color and brightness Resolve uses to feed your monitor, and you match it to whatever your display can actually handle. Your choices are 8-bit and 10-bit. 10-bit is harder on your processor, but it's the better option because you're less likely to see banding, which is those visible steps you sometimes see in a smooth gradient like a sky. That banding is often just an 8-bit monitoring feed showing its limits, not a real flaw in the footage. So setting this to 10-bit stops you from chasing a problem that isn't really there in your image. Monitor scaling controls how Resolve resizes the picture to fit your monitor, and most of the time you can ignore it. You'd only reach for it in a specific spot, smoothing out the edges when you're viewing on a projector with a really big screen, where it tames the rough, jaggy artifacts that can crop up. You might also notice it if you're checking a HD or 2K project on an old SD monitor. The other option, bilinear, behaves differently, depending on your screen you're plugged into. So if you switch to it, have a quick look and make sure it's actually doing your setup a favor instead of making things look worse. Then we have an option to use Rec 601 matrix for 422 SDI output, and the manual literally says, don't use this checkbox unless you know what it does, you know who you are. I am not a broadcast engineer and I have no idea what it does, so I am not touching it. This Enable HDR metadata option is studio only. When you're working in HDR, your footage carries extra information that tells the display how to show all that added brightness and contrast correctly. Tick this box and Resolve will send that information along with the picture so a HDR-capable screen on the other end knows what it's looking at and decodes it properly. Now we have the section for optimized media and render cache. Before we go through the individual settings, here's the idea that kind of ties them together. Some footage is just hard to play back in real time, either because it's in a really high resolution or it's in a format that your computer finds hard work. And some effects can be really taxing on your machine as well. So Resolve can make lighter stand-in versions of the footage and pre-cooked copies of the effects, and it will play those instead of doing all of that grunt work live. Now these settings are going to decide how those stand-ins and copies get made. Proxy media and optimized media are both replacement versions of your clips that are easier to play than the originals. Render cache is different. It's Resolve pre-rendering your effects and grades so they play back instantly instead of being calculated on the fly. Proxy media resolution has a drop-down for how small to make your proxies. You can keep them at the clip's original size, or shrink them to a half, a quarter, 1/8, 1/16, or you just let Resolve pick based on your timeline. Proxy media format sets the file types your proxies are written in. Optimized media resolution has the same set of choices as the proxies: original, half, quarter, 1/8, 1/16, or let Resolve decide from your timeline settings. Optimized media format, as the name suggests, lets you pick the format, whichever fits your needs. Render cache format sets the file type for your cached effects. Then we've got an option to enable background caching after X seconds. Resolve can cache quietly on its own once you stop working. This sets how many seconds of you sitting idle it's going to wait before it starts. Now, a quick note on the two ways Resolve caches. Smart cache is automatic, so Resolve decides what needs caching. User cache is a much more hands-on manual mode where you choose what gets cached. And the next three checkboxes are for user mode. You can automatically cache transitions, composite and opacity effects, so the stuff where clips are layered or blended, and anything you've got built on the Fusion page. And then we've got working folders. These fields just tell Resolve where to put the various files it creates as you work. First, you've got project media location, and this one's going to let you point all of the project's generated media to a single folder of your choosing. And by generated media, I mean anything Resolve makes itself rather than footage you brought in. So like audio from the voiceover tool or voice convert, something like that, which makes handing off, moving, or relinking the project way less painful later on. It automatically creates subfolders by media type at that location, so it's easy to send some or all of it somewhere else. You can also set this when you first create a project in the new project dialog. The proxy generation location sets the folder where your proxy files get saved. Anything you generate as a proxy will end up here. The cache files location sets where your render cache files go. By default, this is going to point to a folder called cache clip, which Resolve tucks away in the first media storage volume that you set in the preferences. The gallery stills location will set where your saved stills on the color page are going to end up. This one will default to a folder called gallery, again created on that first media storage volume from your preferences. Then we have frame interpolation. Slow motion needs more frames than the footage actually has, and fast motion needs fewer. So Resolve has got to decide how to invent or drop those frames to make it work. And these settings will set the default for how it handles that across the whole project. Retime process picks the default method for any clip that's been sped up, slowed down, or doesn't match the project frame rate. Since every clip starts out set to project settings in the inspector, changing this changes the behavior for most of your clips all at once, apart from any that you've given custom settings to. Nearest is the simplest and easiest on your computer. For fast motion, it just drops frames, and for slow motion, it just repeats them. It's usually the worst looking of the bunch. Frame blend is still light on your system, but tends to look a little bit smoother. Instead of repeating frames outright, it's going to dissolve the neighboring frames together to blend the motion. It still honestly doesn't look great. Optical flow is the most demanding, but it's the highest quality. So instead of just dropping or repeating frames, it will study the movement in the shot, and it's going to build brand new frames from scratch. When the motion is clean and steady, it can look really smooth. Its weak spot is messy motion. If there's things crossing in opposite directions or sort of shaky camera work, it can trip it up and cause artifacts. Motion estimation mode kicks in whenever optical flow is doing the work, and it also affects image stabilization and temporal noise reduction on the color page. It's basically a quality versus speed dial, and there's a few different tiers. Standard faster and standard better are the long-standing options from older versions of Resolve. They're pretty efficient and they give decent results for most jobs. Enhanced faster and enhanced better should clean up almost any case where the standard options showed artifacts, but they work your system a bit harder, so they're also slower on most machines. Speed warp faster and speed warp better step it up again for slow motion, using the DaVinci neural engine. Now this is even harder to play back, and the results will depend on the footage, but at their best, they in theory give you the best results. AI's Speed Warp Metal is a Mac-only version of Speed Warp tuned for Apple hardware. It should make those neural engine calculations dramatically faster. When optical flow is in play, motion range lets you match the setting to the kind of movement in your footage, small, medium, or large motion. The idea is that pointing Resolve at the right type of motion can clean up the result. The problem is you have to set this for every clip here. In the inspector, they forgot to give you the option to set this on a clip-by-clip basis. This next section controls how your project talks to Blackmagic Cloud, which is Blackmagic's service for storing projects online and letting a team work on the same one together. Here's what each part does. Project media location sets where the media you download from a Blackmagic Cloud project lives on your computer. Folder location shows the current path where the cloud media is stored. To change it, hit the Change Location button and pick a new spot in the file browser. Multi-user collaboration decides whether more than one person can work on a project at once. So tick this to switch on the collaboration tools for that cloud project. Leave it off if it's just you. Then we have Blackmagic Cloud Storage Syncing. Now, these options will control what gets uploaded and kept in sync with your Blackmagic Cloud storage. For media files, sets how much of your media to upload for other people to access. You've got 3 choices. Don't sync media, upload nothing. So if the other location already has the footage and you just want to collaborate on the project, this is the one for you. Sync proxies only will upload just the lightweight proxy files. Sync proxies and originals will upload both the proxies and the full original files. If you tick Generate Proxies automatically, Resolve will make proxy versions of your master clips for you without you having to do anything by hand. You pick the format from these options here. Display Synced Media In sets the time window for showing synced media so you control what shows up. Remote Cameras sets what Blackmagic camera and camera app users are allowed to do. Turn this on and people using a Blackmagic camera or the camera app, as long as they're members of the project, can upload their camera footage straight to your Blackmagic storage when they finish recording, and it will drop right into the project's media pool. The Blackmagic Cloud website button will just take you out to the Blackmagic Cloud web interface, where you set up access and pay for the various services. The image scaling section is all about how Resolve resizes clips, from scaling footage up to fill a bigger frame, to shrinking it down, or fitting clips that don't match your project resolution. First is the resize filter. When Resolve resizes an image, it's got to invent or blend pixels to make the new size work, and this is what picks the method it uses. Smoother tends to look the best when you're scaling clips down to fit an SD frame. Bicubic is sort of the middle ground. It's not quite as sharp as the top options, but it's still very good and it's easier on your processor, so it's a fine everyday choice. Bilinear is the lightweight one, lower quality, but gentle on a slower machine, so it's handy for previewing your work before you render. Then you swap it up to something better for the final. Sharper usually wins when you're scaling clips up to fill a larger frame or down to HD. Custom hands you the exact algorithm with a long list to pick from. In real use, the differences between these are pretty subtle and a bit subjective, so the main reason to touch it is to match the exact resizing method from another app. For normal work, Resolve standard filters should be just fine. Override input scaling will apply an input sizing preset across the whole project. Override output scaling is the same idea for an output sizing preset. De-interlace quality is studio only, and it sets the quality versus time trade when you de-interlace clips using the Enable de-interlacing checkbox in the clip attributes. Normal is high quality and fine for most footage. On a lot of clips, you honestly can't tell it apart from high. It's also what Resolve always uses during playback. High works your processor harder and can look better on some footage, but at the cost of slower renders. DaVinci Neural Engine will use machine learning to study the motion between the two fields and then rebuild them into one clean frame. It's very demanding, but at its best, it should look nicer than even the high setting. Input scaling has a single setting, mismatch resolution files, for deciding what happens when a clip doesn't match your project resolution. You've got 4 options. Center crop with no resizing doesn't scale anything. Clips that are smaller than the frame get blank space around them, and clips bigger than the frame will get cropped. Scale full frame with crop sizes the clip so its shortest side fills the frame, then trims off whatever spills over the edges. Scale entire image to fit is the default. It sizes the clip so its longest side fits the frame, which leaves gaps on the shorter side. Stretch frame to all corners squishes or stretches the clip to fill the frame completely in every direction. Output scaling lets you send out a different resolution than your timeline, which is useful for monitoring or rendering. If your deliver page render resolution differs from your timeline, these settings are what makes that conversion happen. Match timeline settings is on by default, so your output will just mirror your timeline resolution and scaling. You switch it off when you want different settings for monitoring, tape, or rendering, using those options below. Output resolution is where you pick your alternate resolution. 4 lets you set a custom alternate resolution of your own. Pixel aspect ratio sets an alternate pixel aspect ratio to match your alternate format. Mismatch resolution files has the same 4 choices as the input scaling group above, just applied to your alternate output resolution. Superscale is a high-quality upscaling option that genuinely builds new pixels rather than just stretching existing ones, so it's really demanding on your system. Choices are none, 2x, 3x, 4x, the enhanced version of those, and auto. Honestly, nearly everyone can leave this whole panel on its defaults. Now we get to the section that probably causes the most arguments on YouTube, and that's color management. Now this one really does deserve a video all of its own, but if you're brand new to this, I do want to give you kind of a quick overview because it can seem sort of intimidating when you dive in, but it really doesn't need to. So here's the problem it solves. Every camera records color in its own way, a little bit like its own dialect. A shot from one camera and then a shot from another might describe the same sort of shade of red, for instance, quite differently. and then every screen will show colors slightly differently as well. So if you just start grading raw footage, you end up sort of wrestling each clip to look right and then hoping it holds up wherever it lands. So think of color management like the translator that sits in the middle. So it takes whatever files that your different cameras have recorded, and it converts all of them into one common color space that it's going to work in. And then it will convert it all back out to suit wherever the video is headed. So the payoff is that your footage is going to behave predictably. And then you're going to spend way less time fighting mismatched clips. The color science dropdown is where you choose which translation system you want to use. DaVinci YRGB is the traditional hands-on option with no automatic management at all. Resolve doesn't translate anything for you. You grade the footage directly, and it's entirely on you to make each clip look right and match the others using LUTs or color space transform effects. DaVinci YRGB Color Managed is Blackmagic's own automatic system, and you might see it called RCM in some places. You tell Resolve what you shot on and where the video is going, and then it handles the translations in the background. It's sort of the friendliest way to get consistent colors across a mix of cameras without wading into anything too technical. It's probably a good place to start, especially if you're a beginner. ACES CC and ACES CCT are two variations of the ACES system, which is sort of a more open version of Blackmagic's automatic system because it's available on all sorts of different software, not just Resolve. It's pretty standard in film and television, but it's very important if you're collaborating with other people that you're all certain which one you're going to use. They run through the same ACES pipeline and are nearly identical. The only real difference is how your shadows respond while you grade. ACES CC uses a straight curve all the way down, but ACES CCT adds a gentle toe or a slight lift in the very darkest part of the picture. So when you push your shadows around, they feel a little bit softer and more natural, kind of closer to how traditional log footage grades. That's why plenty of colorists pick ACES CCT of the two. This video is already long enough, so I'm going to defer to my friend Darren Mostyn, who has been a professional colorist for years, and he's also got a great YouTube channel that you should check out for more information on this topic. With that said, if you're new to color management, assuming the majority of you watching are making videos that will end up on social media or YouTube, to get started, I'd set it up like this. Then in your media pool, select your footage, right-click on it, go to Input Color Space, and tell Resolve the format it was shot in. If you've got footage from multiple cameras, you'll need to do that for each one. If the format that your camera shoots in doesn't show up here, then you'll want to download the Rec. 709 conversion LUT from the camera manufacturer and use that instead. These next three sections are all about some different flavors of HDR grading, so if that's what you're doing, you'll need to select the appropriate parts for your grade. And that's a bit out of scope for this video. Under that, you've got a section dedicated to LUTs or lookup tables. Now, I'll be honest, this is a section I don't use other than for one part, which I'll point out here in a minute. Just so we're on the same page, a LUT or a lookup table is basically a pre-made color recipe. So you feed an image in, and the LUT swaps every color for a new one according to its recipe, and a different looking image will come out. The LUTs in this panel are special in that they hit every timeline in the entire project at once, rather than a single clip. Now, the reason there are several slots is that each one drops the LUT into a different point in Resolve's processing chain. So where you place it changes what it affects. Input lookup table slots a LUT right at the very start before Resolve does anything else to the picture. Output lookup table applies after your color page work is done, but just before the monitoring LUT below. This one does get baked into your final render, unlike the monitor-only slots coming up. Video monitor lookup table applies right at the end after everything else, but here's the key bit. It's for your eyes only. This LUT is only ever used to feed your monitor. It never touches your rendered files or anything you send out to tape. It's a good spot for a film emulation LUT if you're actually printing to film. So you can preview how a log project would look once it was printed and shown in a cinema. Color viewer lookup table is the same monitoring idea, but aimed at the viewer on your computer screen specifically, separate from what's going to your main grading display. By default, it just follows the video monitor LUT, so you don't have to think about it. But you can use it to calibrate your computer monitor on its own. Then you have the scopes lookup table. Now, normally, Resolve scopes show you the honest, untouched data, which is exactly what you want for accurate readings. This lets you override that and have the scopes reflect your monitored look instead, using the video monitor LUT or any other LUT you've got on your system. Now, like I said, I don't use any of these options because I control everything from the color page. And unless you've got a special reason to, I doubt many of you will ever use them either. But now you know what they are at least. This next option I always double check though. 3D lookup table interpolation sets the quality of how 3D LUTs are calculated, and it's worth understanding why that choice exists. A 3D LUT only holds a fixed number of color points. So for instance, a 17 by 17 by 17 grid, which is 4,913 set transforms. Now your image has got way more colors than that. So Resolve has got to guess the in-between values, and this picks how it does that guessing. Trilinear is the default. Its main job is backwards compatibility, matching older Resolve grades and the way LUTs looked in other apps. Tetrahedral technically works your processor a bit harder, but I've never seen any real-world difference in my computer's performance. Plus, it gives cleaner results with less color banding, and it's the better pick unless you specifically need to match an older project or a LUT built in another program. The Update Lists button refreshes the LUT dropdowns if you've dropped new LUTs into your system since opening Resolve, so they actually show up. The Open LUT Folder button opens the main LUT folder on your computer so you know where to put new ones. Under that, we have a section for AMF locations. AMF stands for ACES metadata file. And this is a section where you point Resolve to where your ACES metadata file lives so it can pull in the correct transforms and looks without manual setup. If you're not running an ACES pipeline with AMF files coming from onset or dailies, you can leave it be. Then we've got the Broadcast Safe section where you can select Broadcast Safe IRE levels. Now, they're the same job done at 3 different strictness levels. And the one you pick is set by whatever your broadcaster's delivery spec asks for. -20 to 120 is the loosest, -10 to 110 sits in the middle, and 0 to 100 is the strictest. And what's changing is how much of the signal is allowed to overshoot past the normal legal band before Resolve clamps it. If a broadcaster gave you a delivery spec, use whatever band they specify. Every network has got its own requirements, so this is going to be dictated by their paperwork, not by some universal default. If you've got no spec and just want to be bulletproof, 0 to 100 is a safe pick. It will pass essentially any QC at the cost of the hardest clipping. For videos that are watched online, you usually don't need Broadcast Safe on at all. YouTube and Vimeo aren't going to run the legal levels quality control that a TV station does, so a standard Rec 709 export is normally fine. In fact, just setting your render data levels to video handles most of the Luma legality issues without touching Broadcast Safe. If you want a light safety net for web, you can switch it on, but it isn't a requirement. And I will say this setting is a fairly blunt clamp. It's better to get your levels legal with manual controls on the color page while watching your scopes, because a hard clip can look really rough and it won't always tame a really aggressive blast of chroma. The general options panel is sort of a grab bag of general preferences for how Resolve looks and behaves, and the first bit is all about conforming. When you bring in a project from another editing program, all you're really doing is importing a list of instructions, which clips in what order cut where. Conforming is just Resolve matching that instruction list back up with the media files so your timeline rebuilds correctly. And it does this by reading identifying information off of each clip, things like timecode, real names, file names, and file paths. And these settings are going to control how it goes about making that match. Use timecode sets how Resolve reads timecode from your media. You've got 2 choices. Embedded in the source clip is the one most people want. As long as the timecode is baked into the file, Resolve can use it to reconform clips automatically, even if you swap a clip from a different file later. From the source clip frame count is the fallback for footage that's got no timecode at all, only a running frame count numbering each frame in order. Then we have conform partial clips with black gaps. Sometimes a clip is missing a few frames the timeline is asking for. So turn this on and Resolve fills those gaps with black instead of failing, and it flags the short clip with a little P on its thumbnail in the edit page so you know that it's incomplete. Automatically conform missing clips added to media pool is on by default, and you have to switch it off for collaborative workflows. And when it's on, Resolve keeps a live link between the clip in your media pool and the clips in your timelines. So if you import media whose timecode, file names, or real names match clips that are currently missing from a timeline, Resolve automatically slots them back into place for you. For this next one, a real name is basically a label that identifies where a clip came from, and the name's a bit of a hangover from physical film reels and tapes. Turn this on, and Resolve leans on those real names when matching clips, which is often more reliable. You get 4 ways to tell Resolve where to find the real name. Source clip file path name digs the real name out of the clip's file path. That can be part of the file name itself, or part of any folder name along the path. Exactly how it pulls it is set by the pattern field. A pattern is just a little code that spells out how to extract the real name from that path. Media pool folder name takes the real name from whichever bin the clip is sitting in. This is popular for stereo or 3D projects, where footage is split into left and right folders, and for jobs where new VFX shots land every day. Embedding in source clip file is for formats that carry the real name inside the file itself. Source clip file name just uses the file's name as the real name. Then you've got an option to limit real name matching to X characters. Sometimes your media files have extra junk characters on the end of their real names that don't match what the project file expects. So this lets you chop a set number of characters off the end of the real name so the 2 line back up. Ignore the first X characters of the real name is the same idea at the other end. You'll just trim a set number of characters off the start. So use the 2 together and you can whittle any messy real name down to just the part that actually matches. Then you have extract real names from EDL comments. Now some formats like R3D have got real names that are longer than the 8 characters that an old school EDL will allow. This lets Resolve pull the full real name out of specially formatted EDL comments instead. Sort timeline using real number and timecode changes how C mode sorts your timeline. Left on, which is the default, clips are grouped by reel first, then by timecode. So footage from the same reel with similar timecode sits together. Switch it off, and Resolve ignores reels and sorts purely by timecode, which can jumble sources together, but is occasionally what you want. Mixed frame rate format can only be set before importing media. It decides how Resolve handles a timeline where clips run at different frame rates, and specifically how closely retimed clips match the way they looked in whatever program they came from. The same dropdown pops up in the Load XML and AAF dialogues. If you're editing from scratch inside Resolve, or if you're importing an XML or AAF from Premiere Pro, Media Composer, Smoke, or most other editors, just leave it on Resolve. If you're importing an XML from Apple software, pick the Final Cut Pro 7 or Final Cut Pro X option to match. If you leave it set to none, Resolve forces every clip to play at your timeline frame rate. So if your timeline is 24 frames a second, then clips that are shot at 30 or 50 or 23.976 all get dragged to 24, so they'll play slower or faster. Then we've got the color section. The first option names your saved stills for you instead of leaving you to do it. The naming dropdown picks what the name is based on. You can choose the clip name, the version name, source or timeline timecode, the timeline name, the display LUT name, or a custom label that you build out of metadata tags. Append still number on export will just add a number onto each still so they don't all share a name. As suffix or prefix just decides whether that number goes on the end or on the front. Then we have luminance mixer defaults to 0. This sets the luma or Y channel of every grade to 0. Now, the reason it exists is compatibility. You need it on to export a clean ASC CDL, which is a standard portable bundle of basic color values that other software can read. For the next option, back in version 12.5, Resolve improved its log grading controls to give smoother, nicer results from the same knobs. So this checkbox lets a project swap between the old behavior and the new one. So older grades will still look the way they did. Projects made in older versions open with this on. Brand new projects will have it off. Use S-curve for contrast is on by default. It makes the contrast control ease off gently at the very top and bottom, so your highlights and your shadows don't get harshly clipped when you push the contrast up. If you'd rather contrast be applied in a straight line and don't mind the signal clipping at the extremes, just switch it off. Then we've got another option to help with old projects. Version 14.1.1 improved how window tracking handles transforms. Now, new projects should leave this off. Older projects should leave it on, so their existing tracking and transforms stay exactly where they were. Apply stereoscopic convergence to windows and effects is for stereoscopic 3D work, which I have never done, and it's safe to ignore it unless you're actually cutting 3D stuff. Use local version for new clips in timeline makes new clips default to a local grade, one that just lives on that clip, rather than a remote grade that's shared across every matching copy of that clip. Turn it off if you want the older shared grade behavior from version 9 and before. Then we have automatically match master timeline with media pool. Switch this on before importing anything, and Resolve will build a master timeline that always holds everything in your media pool, updating itself as you add or remove media. Once media is in the project, you can't change this setting anymore. Next, we have save timeline thumbnails with project. Leave this off to keep your project small and quick to save and load. Turn it on, and Resolve stuffs every timeline thumbnail inside the project itself, on each save and autosave. This gives a nice visual history of the project, but it's slower and eats up more disk space. This next one is a niche compatibility toggle that flips the color channel order to blue, green, red for DPX version 2 media. You're only going to touch this if a specific DPX workflow needs it. Next is embed timecode in audio output. Turn this on and Resolve sends out LTC timecode, which is timecode carried as an audio signal, on channel 16 of the SDI stream and channel 2 of the analog audio output. It's for keeping other gear in sync. Use timelines bin can only be set up before you add clips to the media pool. Switch it on, and Resolve creates a dedicated timelines bin pinned to the top of the bin list, which holds every timeline in the project. You won't be able to file timelines anywhere else, and any new imported timelines drop in there automatically. You can still add subfolders inside it to stay organized. Node stack layers sets how many node stack layers you get on the color page. So node stacks let you pile several full node trees on top of each other for a single clip. Post-group node stack layer adds one final layer after all of the rest, so you can set aside that last layer purely for post-group grades and transforms. The dynamics profile comes into play with keyframes. Now, a keyframe is just a marker that pins a value at a moment in time. So set 2 of them with different values, and then Resolve animates smoothly from one to the other, which is how a keyframed effect on the color page moves over a shot. This setting controls the feel of that movement. By default, it's linear, which means the change happens at a steady, even pace the whole way through, with both the dynamic profile start and dynamic profile end values sitting at 1. If you want the transition to speed up or slow down instead of marching along kind of mechanically, you can change these to ease it so the effect glides in or out more gently rather than snapping between values. For what it's worth, I've never touched this option. A version is simply a saved alternative grade for a clip. You can build several looks for the same shot and switch between them, and each one is a version. These 10 text fields let you preload default names for those versions, rather than being left as version 1, 2, 3, and so on. So next to each field, there's a drop-down menu of ready-made names for you to pick from. Or you can just clip into the field and type whatever you want. Then we've got the camera raw panel. Now, a raw file is the untouched data straight off the camera sensor before the camera has committed to a look. It hasn't baked in things like white balance or exposure the way a normal video file does. Instead, it stores that stuff as metadata, which is basically a set of notes attached to the footage. Because those notes are just notes, you can change them after the fact without damaging the underlying image, which is a big part of why people shoot in RAW. This panel is where you do that changing. It's got a group of controls for each RAW format the Resolve supports, and it lets you override the original settings that the camera recorded, things like white balance or ISO it was set to when it was shot. Adjust the settings here, and they apply to every RAW clip in the project at once, rather than making you tweak each clip one by one. So it's a handy setting for sort of sensible baselines across all your RAW footage before you start grading. The capture and playback section is where you set up the controls to ingest or output video to tape machines hooked up to your computer. Now, like I said before, I've not done that in over 15 years when I was on like Avid and Final Cut 7, and I had the benefit of a bunch of broadcast engineers that set it all up for me, so I'm going to have to skip this bit, I'm afraid. After that, we have the Subtitles and Transcription panel. That's where you set the house rules for any subtitles you create on a subtitle track. Max character per line defaults to 60, and it caps how many characters can sit on a single line before Resolve wraps onto a second one. Now, the default is pretty generous, so it's worth knowing what the delivery platforms actually expect if your video is heading somewhere specific. Like, for instance, one reference would be Netflix, which caps most Latin alphabet languages at 42 characters per line, with a maximum of 2 lines per caption. A lot of other streamers sit around that same mark. Traditional broadcast subtitling tends to run a little bit tighter, often in the high 30s. Just make sure you check the delivery specs for wherever you're sending your file. Minimum caption duration defaults to 3 seconds. It sets the shortest time that a subtitle is allowed to stay on screen, so captions don't flash past too quickly to read. Maximum characters per second defaults to 30. This is a reading speed limit. Resolve works out, based on how long a caption is on screen, the most characters per second that it should contain, so viewers aren't asked to read faster than is comfortable. Resolve's default is looser than a lot of platforms, so you'd want to check with the place where you're delivering for what number they're expecting. The transcription panel is separate. It's for Resolve's automatic transcription, where it listens to your audio and turns the speech into text for you. You can pick the language being spoken so Resolve knows what it's listening for. Set it to auto, and Resolve will analyze the audio and work out the language itself. If your language isn't in the main list, tick Enable Extended Language Support to switch on a wider set of languages. Now, it's currently in beta, so treat it as a work in progress rather than a finished feature. The Fusion section is pretty short. These settings deal with one specific housekeeping detail: how Fusion numbers the frames inside a composition. Every Fusion composition has its own internal frame count, and this lets you decide what number that count starts on. The point is consistency. You can have every comp in a project start on the same frame number, even if the clips they're built on are trimmed differently or sit at different spots in the timeline. In a new project, you can set that starting number yourself. Legacy Fusion composition frame count is the old way of doing this. This ties frame 0 of the composition to the very first frame of the clip source media, so the comp's numbering is anchored to the footage rather than to a number that you choose. Default start frame is the newer, more flexible option. You just type in the frame number that you want your comps to begin on, and every new composition in the project starts there. This smooths out visual effects work in a few different ways. It keeps keyframes lined up correctly when you swap one asset for another that has different frame offsets, like a subclip or maybe a round trip from another program. And it lets you render to exact frame ranges when a client's delivery spec demands it, because some pipelines expect comps to start at a set number, like frame 1000, rather than at frame 1. And it keeps reference compositions behaving consistently when you apply the same comp to different clips with different trims. Then we have downscale to timeline resolution for timeline clip compositions. Tick this, and Resolve shrinks your media down to the timeline resolution before it runs any Fusion work, which lightens the load and helps complex comps play back more smoothly. Now, one catch, it doesn't work on EXR media. Now we're onto the Fairlight panel, which sets up your project's audio. A few of these lock once you get going, so they're worth setting up early. We start with audio sample rate. Now, sample rate is just how many little snapshots of sound Resolve takes every second. The more snapshots means more detail. It's measured in kilohertz, and it defaults to 48 kilohertz or 48,000 snapshots a second, which is the standard for broadcast and for cinema. You can bump it up to 96 or 192 if you want to work at higher precision. There are 2 things you need to know. First, you can only set this before you make your first timeline. After that, it's locked for the project. And secondly, higher isn't free. 96 kHz uses roughly twice the processing power and makes the files twice the size. So only reach for it if you actually need that precision. And don't worry about mismatched files. Resolve automatically resamples any audio that you input to match your project's rate so it plays properly. The next option is used fixed bus mapping. Now, a bus is just a channel that audio gets routed into. It's a way of grouping tracks together so they flow to the right place. Fixed bus mapping is the old, sort of rigid way of handling that routing. FlexBus is the newer, far more flexible system. This checkbox lets a new project fall back to the old fixed method if you need it. You can switch a fixed bus project over to FlexBus by unticking the box, but be warned, it is a one-way trip, and you can't go back to legacy busing afterwards. Now, FlexBus is such an improvement, you won't regret the switch. Tick this next one to record audio in 32-bit float. The short version of why that's nice, it gives you an enormous amount of headroom, so a recording that comes in too loud or too quiet can often be rescued afterwards without the sound breaking up. The audio hardware that you're using to record audio needs to support 32-bit, so you'll want to confirm that because checking this is going to do nothing if your equipment can't actually do it. Now, this is a handy one that you've probably never noticed. Since version 14, Fairlight actually drops a tiny 1.5 millisecond crossfade between neighboring clips. Now, you'd never actually hear the fade itself, but it just stops clicks and pops that can happen at edit points. Now, it's on by default, but you can switch it off if you need to hear the clips completely untouched, right up to the very edges. Next, we have Enable Ramp Up on Play. With this on, your mix fades in very briefly each time you hit play, which stops a click at the moment playback starts. The default fade is 2.1 milliseconds, adjustable up to 100. Now, it's especially handy on big mixes with lots of tracks. These next settings customize the meters, which are the moving bars that show you how loud your audio is. Meter type picks the meter style. Now, I'll be honest, I usually leave most of this section on the default, other than the loudness section, which we'll get to shortly. Choosing custom opens up the finer controls. Level detector chooses how the meter measures level. Sample program, VU, or RMS. Now, these are different ways of reading loudness, some reacting to instant peaks, others react to a more sort of average level. Scale sets the measurement scale, either the IEC standard or quasi-linear. Decay sets how quickly the meter falls back down after a peak, in seconds per 20 decibels. Peak indicator sets how long the meter holds its highest reading so you can catch it, from off through various hold times up to infinite hold. Pre-fader metering on tracks decides what the meters actually show, and it comes down to two working styles. Unticked means it's set to post-fader level, which shows you the level after your volume fader. So pull a track's fader down and its meter drops as well. Now, this matches how video editors usually think, because it gives you a visual sense of the relative levels you've balanced your tracks to. If you tick the box, you set it as pre-fader, which shows the clip's original level regardless of where you've set the fader. Even if you've pulled the track right down, the meter still shows what's really in the clip. This is how a lot of audio specialist software works, and it's useful for seeing how much level you've got in reserve if you want to bring a track back up later. Target loudness level will set the reference loudness for the meters in LUFS, which is a unit built to match how loud things actually sound to us. It defaults to minus 23 LUTs, which is one of the broadcast standards. YouTube has a standard of minus 14, so just set that for whatever standard you're aiming at. Loudness scale picks the range that the meter displays across. The default is the EBU +9 scale of minus 18 to +9. You've also got an EBU +18 scale, which is minus 36 to +18 if you want a wider view. Bus meter alignment level sets the peak points of the bus meter. Bus meter high level sets the level where the meter starts going red, your too hot warning. Bus meter low level sets the level where the meter starts showing yellow. The next section is for path mapping, and its job is to fix something that can be a real headache in team workflows in particular. Now, say an editor and a colorist are working on the same project and they've got media in a shared cloud folder somewhere. On the editor's Mac in one location, that footage is on one path, but on the colorist's PC in another location, that exact same footage sits at a completely different path because Macs and Windows machines organize their drives differently. Now, normally that mismatch means constant relinking. Every time one of them opens the other's work, Resolve can't find the files, and they have to point it at the media all over again. Path mapping fixes that. Each person tells Resolve their own local path to the shared folder, and from then on, Resolve translates the addresses on the fly. As long as everyone's media sits in the same structure inside that shared folder, the relinking just stops. Now, it's handy if you're working solo as well. If you're on a laptop, you can map your local media folder to your NAS, so you don't have to relink every time you leave the office and come back. Now, one clarification worth making, because there's an old feature it kind of resembles. The old mapped mount option needed every user to know everyone else's file path, which kind of gets messy really quickly. Path mapping is way smarter because you only ever tell Resolve your own path, and then it just handles the translation for everybody else. Project media locations is where you actually set it up. The idea is that everyone shares one common media folder, and each person registers the path to that folder as it appears on their own machine. Location shows the name of the shared folder. Local path shows where that folder lives on your own computer. Add opens a file browser so you can select the shared folder. Once you've picked it, hit Browse and point Resolve at that folder's path on your machine. Remove takes the shared folder back out of your path mapping settings. Now, it only removes the mapping, it doesn't delete the actual folder or anything in it. Automatically set up when relinking is a nice convenience. With this on, whenever you relink offline media, Resolve builds a mapping for you automatically. It compares the path saved in the project against the path you just pointed it to, and then works out the relationship between the two, and then checks whether your other missing media follows the same pattern, relinking whatever it can. It does the same check for proxies in their subfolders, so a single relink can quietly sort out a whole batch of files. And finally, we have Apple Immersive, which is a format for making content that you watch on Apple's Vision Pro headset, that kind of wraparound 3D sort of video that surrounds you rather than sitting flat on a screen. This panel is where you set that content up correctly, and it's only relevant if you're actually producing for the Vision Pro. Everyone else can just skip straight past it. The heart of this is something called an ILPD, or Immersive Lens Profile Data. Immersive video is shot on very specialized lenses, and to project the footage back onto the headset so it looks right, Resolve needs to know the exact quirks of the lens it was filmed on. An ILPD file is a set of calibration notes that describe the lens, so that image wraps around the viewer accurately instead of looking warped. These controls are how you load and manage that calibration. Apple Immersive Calibration shows the name of the calibration file in use, so you click the menu to pick from calibration files you've used before. Projection format sets how the footage gets mapped into that immersive wraparound space. Update lists refreshes the ILPD files available in your media pool, so newly added ones will show up. Open calibration folder opens the folder on your computer where the calibration files live, so you can grab the ILPD file you need. Now, this is definitely one of the longest videos I have ever made, so I really appreciate it if you made it all the way through to the end. Now, if you haven't already, I just want to ask you to please take a second to hit that like button down below, because it really does help other people find it. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more Resolve tips and tricks like these. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.